So, you know that phrase, you'll know it when you see it. I mean, we've all said it, right? It implies that we can see through the complexities of human interactions to get to the heart of the matter and look and really just dig in and understand its inherent value. So what do you think? I mean, on the one hand, I like the idea that the good or ill of a set of actions will shine through if we just sort of step back and get some perspective on the situation or the people involved. But on the other hand, I'm not sure that it's always that easy. I mean, what we have to do is read more than one news source and look at all of the confusing stuff going out there in the world and politics and all that stuff. And we can see that there's a lot of machinations going on among the power brokers of our world. And we soon discover that they can have hidden agenda underneath hidden agenda underneath hidden agenda, until at some point we have to start asking ourselves, what is really going on here? And you know what? I don't think that's new news for humanity. I mean, look at these readings for today. I'd like to think that I can just pull up any Bible passage and assume God's plan here. I'll know it when I see it. But this week, there's a lot of human power games that we kind of have to sift through first. Some of it, like that gospel reading, makes you ask, why are we even reading this and where is the good news? God works through humans. It's inherently messy. So where is God's plan in the middle of all of this? And can our human eyes actually see it when it's right in front of us? So I'm going to punt for a bit on the really hard one. I mean, you know which one I mean. And I'm going to start with David bringing the Ark of the Covenant into Jerusalem. There is a lot going on here under the surface. It seems like it's just a pretty basic victory parade, going right down the main street of Jerusalem. Not all that different from the one that we had here in Scotts Valley last weekend. But if you've been with us for the last month or so, you'll know that King David's rise to power as the monarch of this newly united kingdoms of Israel and Judah brought together under his rule, well, it hasn't been easy at all. God actually didn't really want the people to have a king, because kings consolidate power and they wield a lot of it. It's the kind of situation that is just rife with abuse, as we all know. But the people insisted. They wanted to be like all those other nations around them. And God relented and said, okay, you can have a king. So King Saul was a bit of a warm-up, and, well, it didn't go great. David, on the other hand, is meant to be the new and improved version, King 2.0, chosen by God as a young shepherd boy who wandered the hills listening for God's voice. But David had to go through a lot to gain his throne. David, as we meet him today, well, he's now somewhere in his 30s, and he has changed a lot in the process. David has now become this sophisticated leader. He's consolidating his power through the use of a whole battery of spiritual and political symbolism. Now, some of this is great. I mean, he's reaffirmed the people's covenant with God to live in a way that is different from all of those other kingdoms that surround them, so that they can look beyond violence and the accumulation of power and territory to take care care of the people whom you've taken care of, the strangers, the widows, the orphans, and to release the crippling debts of the people who are weighed down by them every 7 years in Jubilee. But David is a shrewd politician too. He has chosen for his capital one that is right there on neutral territory, not in Judah, not in Israel. It's kind of like the Washington, D.C. of the ancient world. David's building his own city, which lets him just kind of sidestep all of those long established power blocks in both Israel and in Judah. But David needs something else too that makes it clear that his administration is the undisputed heir of all of that older power and authority too. So setting up the tabernacle for the ark right in the middle of his new capital city, well, that seals the deal on more than just a recommitment to the people's covenant with God. Moving the ark to Jerusalem, well, it is a huge publicity stunt for David. The ark was God's literal presence. It had been carried with them into battle after battle. David does not want the people to forget that he's the one, the warrior king that led Israel's armies to victory with God on his side 100%. David is also putting himself at the center of the people's sacramental life, too. See, the ark, it used to live in Shiloh, where the descendants of Aaron, the tribe of the priests, made the sacrifices to God on all of the people's behalf. By moving the tabernacle to his capital, David wants to make sure the people never forget that he's the one who's now making those sacrifices on their behalf. I mean, he's even dressing up as a priest. He's saying, I am your link to God now. And there's something else going on here too, because I think David is also trying to keep a closer eye on all of those priests and what they're getting up to. I mean, they have power and leadership also. And David was, in fact, the one who was anointed by Samuel, the high priest, while Saul was still king. David is not about to let anything like that happen on his reign. No way. There's a lot of theater going on here, too. That wonderful dance down the middle of the street with all the instruments and the horns. It's, in fact, a sort of a reminder that even though David's their king, he's still also that shepherd boy who is on a first-name basis with God. David's playing the provider role here, too. He's giving every man or woman who shows up a full measure and ration of meat, bread, and raisins. King David wants everyone to see him as the divinely ordained, benevolent leader right at the center of the political, economic, and religious life of their whole nation. Now, it would be easy for us to just walk away and think, well, that's the full truth of it, and this must be God's plan. I mean, we know it when we see it, right? But remember how God was ambivalent about human kings? And it was for a reason. Even though this part of the Bible was written by David's people, I think that the unseen and ugly underbelly of his rise to power, well, it manages to still show up here too. It shows up in that kind of weird interaction that we get between Michal, his wife, and David while he's dancing in the streets. For a long time, interpreters put all of the weirdness on Michal, like she was somehow brutishly embarrassed to see her husband dancing in the streets. This had to do, I think, with the lack of punctuation in Hebrew. But if you read the full story, you can see that there is also something else going on here. The Bible tells us that Michal loved David. But in all of the power struggles between David and her father Saul, she has just been thrown under the bus over and over and over again. And you know what? I think the heart, it's just been trampled out of her. Saul tried to make David, when he was a young, aspiring part of his army, beholden to him. Tried to make him his son-in-law by giving him Michal as a wife. David turned around and he kind of treated her sort of like fire, like he was willing to draw upon her power whenever it was useful to him. But he made sure that he kind of extinguished the flame, just kind of set her aside out of the way when he didn't need her anymore. And you know what David did? Other things too. He played on her affections, convincing her to deceive and betray her father and spring him from Saul's prison. But then David turns around and he abandons her for years until there she is again, useful to him, and he rips her away from her new husband so that he can use her as leverage over her own brother so that he can consolidate this united rule of the two kingdoms. David owes his life, he owes his crown to Michal, but instead he treats her like a living widow. And he just is out there acquiring new wives and fathering children with them instead of her, so that he can shore up his own dynastic power, just like all of those other kings around them. You know a king when you see one, right? Well, in the middle of all of this sits the actual Ark of the Covenant. Now, we've seen what it looks like. It's a box and it has cherubim on it. But I don't know how many of us know that what it is stylized as a chair or a throne, God's throne. Only, unlike other so-called divine rulers of the day, God doesn't need to be depicted to be present and powerful in the situation. I mean, have you seen Luxor or the Parthenon or, like the Lincoln Memorial? Human rulers have to be shown sitting on their thrones to feel like they're in control. But you know what? God, when you see God, there are no graven images necessary. I mean, the contrast here, it just couldn't be clearer. So if there's an ugly side to David's rule, well, Herod's rule is portrayed as a horror story. I won't subject you to a retelling here. We all just heard it. Just please don't make the mistake of thinking of Salome as the villain here, treating her as if she's some sort of seductress like they did in the Middle Ages. Whether she's Herod's daughter or Herod's stepdaughter or cousin or whatever, it's really not exactly clear here. She is being used as a pawn in someone else's power game. And she's powerless to say no, just like Michal was used by Saul and David. So, I went to see the Black Widow movie on Thursday. Now, I admit, it is not for everyone. It's pretty violent, kind of like the gospel today. But at its center is a powerful and shadowy villain who's really like the focus of this storyline that's all about, in fact, human trafficking. This villain captures and controls girls. And then he uses them as this kind of expendable resource to manipulate the governments of the world from behind the scenes. And all the while, he's sitting on this throne, only it's cast in the futuristic trappings of technology instead of gold or marble. Now, this villain's adversary is two of his escaped girls, and they've gone out and they've experienced friendship and love and even a sort of a family. And you know what? This has transformed them. And now they're coming back. They are coming back to take down his evil empire and liberate all of the stolen girls from their captivity. Now, I know this is a fantastical superhero fiction. There is very little that is realistic about it. But yet, this stuff in the middle of it about the awful depths to which humans can take their abuses of power, well, that sounds pretty familiar, I think. Herod in Mark's gospel functions as a sort of a prelude to Pilate. They're both shown as rulers who are locked into using violence for the preservation of their empires, even when they actually probably would rather not in the situations that they find themselves. But ultimately, if we look at this story and where it fits in Mark's gospel, we have to look at what's around it, because right before it is the story of Jesus sending out the disciples. So many people had come to be healed and to hear Jesus' teaching. He's like, I'm going to send my team out. I'm going to make sure more people can be healed and hear this story about God and how God loves and forgives them. And then right after the story that we heard today, well, that's the feeding of the 5,000. The whole of Mark's gospel is this kind of compare and contrast between the violence and the corruption and the impotence of empire and the redemptive power that is wielded by God through Jesus that heals and transforms and can even overcome death. Thanks to God, unflagging love made flesh in Jesus. Well, you know what? You'll know it when you see it. The disciples and the people that met Jesus and heard his preaching and saw all of those healings, they experienced it. That's the good news of Mark's gospel. St. Paul and the first Christians in that church in Ephesus that we heard being addressed in today's second reading, well, they understood it too. They had learned to live this love that overcomes death as a way to be a new type of community, the body of Christ, hands and feet of God at work in the world. Now, they know this because they know that they're chosen by this love. They're adopted as children and heirs of all that God has in store for them. So, how can they not take what they have seen and known and share it with others? Modern theologian David Luce puts it like this. Jesus came so that there could be a better ending to our stories and the story of the world than we can imagine or construct on our own. And when the temple has just been destroyed, or your marriage is ending, or you've lost your job, or you fear your child will never speak to you again, or you're pretty sure that your friend has betrayed you, or you think that you may have just screwed up the one relationship that meant something to you, then the possibility of another ending, of a good ending, is indeed not just good news, but it is the best news that you can imagine. Yes, all of those machinations of human corruption may look like they are what holds sway in our world too. We can see it every day, and that's not only what's visible on the surface. We know that people are complicated, messy, and capable of abuses of power and even awful violence. But that is not the final word. That is not the end of the story. Those kinds of kings, they may seem as if they are firmly fixed on their thrones, just like those giant idols of old, sitting in their temples. But we know that ultimately they are just impotent fools in need of redemption, just like the rest of us. It is actually God's love and God's grace that is the greatest power of all. That unseen but ever-present God of love, that's the real power that's at work around us. And I guarantee it, you will know it when you see it.